Grant Delacroix broke a man and Appo's collarbone in the parking lot before anyone even learned his last name. Mara Voss didn't and Appo's see it happen. She heard it, a short, ugly crack like a green branch snapping over a knee, and by the time she rounded the feed truck, the new owner and Appo's son was already standing over Dale Petrick with his hands loose at his sides, not even breathing hard, saying, end quote, "You shouldn't Appo's, we moved faster," end quote. Mara and Appo's right hand found the seam of her jeans pocket and pressed flat against her thigh, the way it always did when something in the air went wrong. Old Walt Ellison, who and Appo's hired her 4 years ago and never once asked why she flinched at slamming doors, noticed the gesture and filed it away without comment, same as always. Nobody at Wren Creek Cattle Company knew where the habit came from. Nobody knew about the puckered white line under her right forearm, hidden by a long sleeve even in July heat, or why she always parked her truck facing out. They knew Mara Voss as the foreman who could gentle a spooked heifer with 2 words and a slow hand, who ran the weaning program tighter than any outfit in 3 counties, and who was owed a $15,000 performance bonus on September 1st, money already spent in her head on a surgery her niece needed before winter. Grant had been on the property 11 days. His father, Walt, had sold him 40% of the ranch 6 months back, a soft landing after some vague trouble in Houston nobody discussed above a whisper. Grant called it, end quote, modernizing operations, end quote. The hands called it something else, end quote. He and Appo's LL settle, end quote. Walt had told her that morning, not quite meeting her eyes, end quote. Give the boy some room, end quote. Mara had given him room. She and Appo's given him 11 days of room. Dale was on the ground now, cradling his arm, and Grant was already turning away like the matter was closed, like a man and Appo's shoulder was a line item he and Appo's resolved, end quote. Hey, end quote, Mara said. Just that. Grant turned back, and for the first time he really looked at her. The stillness in her stance, the flat quiet of her voice, and something in his easy, contemptuous smile flickered, just slightly, like he and Appo's stepped on a stone he hadn't and Appo's expected to be there. He didn't and Appo's apologize. That was the first thing Mara noticed, and it told her everything about the next 11 days that had led here, and everything about the days still coming. End quote. He grabbed the gate wrong, end quote. Grant said, jerking his chin toward Dale, who was gray-faced now, sweat beading along his hairline. End quote. I corrected him. He should thank me. End quote. End quote. You broke his collarbone. End quote. End quote. I demonstrated proper joint mechanics. End quote. Grant rolled his shoulders loose and easy, a man perfectly at peace with what he and Appo's done. End quote. This is a ranch, not a daycare. If your hands can and Appo's take correction, that and Appo's a hiring problem, not a me problem. End quote. Mara knelt by Dale, checked his pupils, the angle of his shoulder, the color returning slowly to his lips. Behind her, she heard Grant exhale through his nose, bored, already moving on in his mind. End quote. Call it in, end quote. She said over her shoulder to Korea, who and Appo's come running from the barn. End quote. Ambulance, not a truck ride. And get Walt. End quote. End quote. Walt and Appo's at the co-op till 3, end quote. Grant said, almost cheerful about it now, like the timing amused him. End quote. So it and Appo's just us for a while, us and Appo's it. End quote. Mara looked up at him. He was 26, built like something engineered in a gym rather than grown on a ranch, wearing a black rash guard with a fight team logo stitched small over the heart. His father and Appo's blood, none of his father and Appo's patience. End quote. You and Appo's we got a weird calm to you, end quote. Grant said, studying her the way a man studies a horse, he and Appo's deciding whether to break or shoot. End quote. Most people, this happens in front of them, they get loud. You didn't and Appo's even blink. End quote. End quote. I and Appo's we seen worse than a collarbone, end quote. Something behind his eyes sharpened at that. A flicker, quick and gone. Not fear. Just recalibration. The first small crack in his certainty about who she was. While they waited, Mara kept 2 fingers loosely on Dale and Appo's wrist, more for his comfort than any real medical need, and talked to him in the low, even voice she used on spooked cattle and startled men alike. And quote, "You and Oppos, we got 3 kids, right?" And quote, she said. And quote, 4 and quote, Dale managed through gritted teeth. And quote, "Youngest just started kindergarten." And quote, "Then you and Oppos, we going to be fine, and you and Oppos, we going to take the next 6 weeks easy, and Walt and Oppos, going to cover you the whole time whether he likes it or not." And quote, she said it loud enough that Korea, hovering nearby with the first aid kit, could hear it too, could carry it back to the rest of the crew like a promise made in front of witnesses. Dale and Oppos' eyes, glassy with pain, found hers. And quote, "He and Oppos' gonna do that again. To somebody. Maybe worse." And quote, "I know," and quote, Mara said, and didn't and Oppos' offer anything false to soften it. Dale and Oppos' ambulance took 40 minutes to arrive on the county road. Grant spent all 40 of them leaning against his truck, scrolling his phone, occasionally glancing at Mara like a man checking on a dog he wasn't, and Oppos' sure was housebroken. Walt came home to a fresh scar on the ranch and Oppos' reputation and a father and Oppos' particular blindness. He listened to Mara and Oppos' account in the kitchen, jaw working, hat still on, and then he did what he and Oppos' been doing for 6 months every time his son and Oppos' name came up in a bad light. And quote, "Dale and Oppos' a big boy," and quote, Walt said. And quote, "Accidents happen around livestock and machinery both. Grant and Oppos' got a temper, I know it, but he and Oppos' trying. He just doesn't, and Oppos' know his own strength yet." And quote, "He knew exactly his own strength, Walt. That and Oppos' the problem." And quote, Walt looked older in that moment than his 68 years, older than the 3 bypass scars Mara had glimpsed once when his shirt rode up hauling feed. And quote, "I need him here, Mara. I need him to want this place. If I run him off over one bad afternoon," and quote, "It wasn't and Oppos' one bad afternoon. It was 11 days building to this," and quote, Walt and Oppos' silence was its own answer, and it was the kind of silence that told Mara something she already suspected. This wasn't and Oppos' really about Dale and Oppos' collarbone at all. It was about a $90,000 note coming due on the North Pasture refinance, one Grant had quietly co-signed, one that gave him leverage far beyond his 40% leverage he and Oppos' already started using, moving equipment off the property, and quote, for repairs, and quote, rerouting 2 water rights transfers through a shell company his lawyer had drawn up in Houston. Mara had seen the paperwork on the desk by accident 3 days earlier. She hadn't and Oppos' told Walt yet. She and Oppos' been trying to find the gentlest way. There wasn't an Oppos' going to be a gentle way anymore. And quote, "I need my bonus paid on schedule," and quote, she said instead, because that was the fight in front of her. And quote, "September 1st. 15,000, same as the contract says." And quote, Walt and Oppos' eyes cut sideways just for a second, toward the desk with the papers on it. And quote, "That might get complicated." And quote, Don and Oppos' let it. And quote, Grant found her in the equipment barn 2 evenings later, oiling a chain on the baler with the radio low and her sleeves rolled to the elbow for once, the heat too heavy to fight. He leaned in the doorway the way he leaned into every room, taking up more of it than his body actually required. And quote, "You went to my father about me," and quote, he said. Not a question. And quote, "I told him what happened. You did the rest." And quote, "Dale and Oppos' suing. Did you know that? 12,000 in medical, and my father and Oppos' lawyer is telling him to just pay it to make it disappear." And quote, Grant and Oppos' voice had an edge now, something petulant under the menace. And quote, "You could and Oppos' smooth that over. Instead you made it a whole production." And quote, "You broke his collarbone in front of 6 witnesses," and quote, "He tensed up wrong on a grip release. That and Oppos' not on me, that and Oppos' poor training," and quote, Grant pushed off the doorframe, closing the distance the way he and Oppos' closed it with Dale, testing the air first, seeing what gave. And quote, "You and Oppos' got opinions about how this ranch should run. Cute." My father and Apo's spent 6 months undoing 40 years of bad habits. The next morning, Grant showed up to the equipment yard wearing a fresh compression sleeve on his own forearm, as if the previous day had left a mark on him too, though everyone knew it hadn't. And Apo's tea. He watched Mara walk the fence line with her coffee, and when she passed close enough he said without preamble, and quote, "My father and Apo's already talked to a lawyer about Dale. Cheapest settlement wins. You should stay out of it." And quote. It and Apo's not my settlement to negotiate. And quote. No, end quote. He agreed, end quote, but you and Apo's the one who keeps making it a story worth talking about. People remember stories. They forget line items, end quote. He said it almost thoughtfully, like a man genuinely trying to teach her something for her own good. And that was somehow worse than if he and Apo's simply threatened her outright. Ruth, 20 feet off, coiling a lead rope with more force than the task required, didn't and Apo's look up, but her jaw was tight enough that Mara could see the muscle working from across the yard. It was the first time Mara understood the crew wasn't Apo's neutral anymore. They were watching, weighing, waiting to see which way the wind would finally break. 3 things happened over the following week, each one tightening the wire a little further. The first, Dale and Apo's lawyer called Walt directly, and the settlement number climbed to $18,000 after Dale and Apo's doctor found nerve involvement nobody had caught in the ER. Grant called it extortion loudly at the supper table, in front of 2 hands who and Apo's stayed late loading trailers and heard every word. The second, Korea, the 18-year-old hand who and Apo's run for help the day of the accident, quietly told Mara he and Apo's seen Grant on the phone behind the equipment barn talking about, and quote, the transfer closing before the old man figures out what the water rights are actually worth, end quote. Korea didn't and Apo's understand what it meant. Mara did. It meant Grant wasn't and Apo's just cruel. He was moving money fast off a ranch that wasn't and Apo's fully his, betting his father would rather keep the peace than look too closely. The third, Grant started calling weaning weight numbers into question, publicly, in front of the crew, suggesting Mara had been padding her own performance metrics to protect her bonus. It wasn't an Apo's true. It was, Mara understood immediately, the opening move in getting her fired before September 1st arrived. Cheaper than paying $15,000 to a woman he and Apo's decided he didn't and Apo's like. Between the second and third of those, a fourth thing happened that Mara didn't and Apo's learn about until later. Grant drove into town Wednesday evening and had drinks at the Blue Spur with 2 men who ran cattle auctions 2 counties over. He and Apo's been asking casually what a herd like Wren Creek and Apo's would fetch if it moved fast and quiet, no paperwork trail, cash preferred. Korea and Apo's cousin who tended bar there thought nothing of it at first. He mentioned it to Korea only because Grant had also in passing called Mara and quote, the help and quote, in a tone that made even the bartender and Apo's eyebrows lift. Korea sat on that detail for 2 more days, not wanting to add weight to what Mara was already carrying. It would matter later more than he knew. End quote. Show me the scale logs, end quote. Grant said Thursday morning in front of the whole crew at the loading chute, arms crossed, sunglasses pushed up into his hair like a man posing for a photograph of his own reasonableness. End quote, because these numbers Don and Apo's track with what I and Apo's am seeing on the trailer counts, end quote. End quote, they and Apo's in the office. Same place they and Apo's been every year. End quote. End quote. Convenient that you and Apo's the only one who ever pulls them, end quote. Big Ruth Alvarado, 61 years old, forearms like braided rope, who and Apo's worked cattle longer than Grant had been alive, spoke up from the fence rail without being asked. End quote. I pull half those logs myself, Grant. Numbers are clean. Always have been. End quote. It was small. A single sentence. But it was the first crack in the wall of silence the crew had been keeping since Grant arrived, and Mara felt it land like a held breath finally released. Grant and Apo's jaw tightened at the correction in front of everyone, from a woman he clearly hadn't and Apo's expected to speak at all. End quote. Nobody asked you, Ruth. End quote. End quote. You asked the whole crew a question with an accusation stapled to it. I answered. End quote. Ruth didn't and Apo's raise her voice either. She just went back to coiling rope unbothered, and something about her calm made Grant and Appo's face go a shade darker. Walt confronted his son that night. Mara heard the raised voices from the porch, heard in quote, "The water rights in quote, and in quote, you had no right in quote, and in quote, I trusted you with the paperwork in quote," through the kitchen window, and for one evening she let herself believe the wire might loosen instead of snap. It didn't end Appo's tea. If anything, it tightened it faster. The next morning, before the sun had fully cleared the eastern ridge, Mara found an envelope tucked under her truck in Appo's wiper blade. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a formal notice drafted on ranch letterhead Grant had no real authority to use, informing her that her performance bonus was in quote, under internal review pending an audit of scale log discrepancies and quote, effective immediately. No signature from Walt. Just Grant and Appo's bold and slanted like a man signing something he was proud of. She stood in the yard a long moment, envelope in hand, doing the math she and Appo's been doing in her head for weeks. $15,000, a surgery scheduled for November, a niece who trusted her the way only a child trusts an adult who has never once let her down. She folded the letter once, put it in her jacket pocket, and did not let her hands shake until she was alone in the cab of her truck 5 minutes later. She called the surgeon and Appo's office that afternoon on her lunch break, voice steady, and asked what the absolute latest date for a deposit could be without losing the November slot. The answer was 3 weeks. She said nothing about it to Walt. Not yet. She and Appo's learned over 4 years on this ranch and considerably longer before it, that some fights you Don and Appo's announce until you and Appo's standing in the middle of them, because announcing them just gives the other side time to prepare. Friday morning, Walt drove to Amarillo for a bank meeting he wooed and Appo's discuss, leaving the ranch in Grant and Appo's hands for the day, a decision Mara suspected was less trust than exhaustion, a father buying himself 6 hours where he didn't and Appo's have to look at what his son had become. By 10 a.m., 3 semi-trailers Mara hadn't and Appo's authorized were backed up to the north pasture holding pens. And quote, "What is this?" and quote, she said, walking up as the first gate swung open on 80 head of prime breeding stock. The herd and Appo's genetic future, the animals Walt had spent 15 years building a bloodline around. And quote, asset reallocation. And quote, Grant didn't and Appo's look up from his phone. And quote, my 40% my call. Buyer and Appo's paying above market cash today. My father will thank me when he sees the number. And quote. And quote, these aren't and Appo's yours to sell. Not without his signature. And quote. And quote. I have power of attorney on the water rights transfer. Funny how broad that document turned out to be, once the lawyers finished with it. And quote. He finally looked up, and the smile he gave her was the same one from the parking lot 11, now 19 days ago. And quote. You want to stop me, Mara? Genuinely curious how you think that goes. And quote. Korea and Ruth and 2 other hands had drifted over, drawn by the trailers, by the wrongness of the scene. Dale, arms still in a sling, stood at the edge of the group. 6 witnesses. The same math as before. And quote. Close the gate and quote, Mara said. And quote, or what, and quote. Grant said again, and this time he stepped into her space the way he had in the barn, closer, testing, except this time his hand came up and closed around her wrist. Not gently. A grip meant to move her, to make a point in front of an audience about who decided things on this ranch. His thumb found the raised line of scar tissue under her sleeve, and his grip tightened out of pure reflexive curiosity. And quote, what is this? And quote. He said, almost delighted, and quote. Some kind of, and quote. She didn't and Appo's answer. She turned her wrist against the weakest point of his grip, the gap between thumb and fingers, and the pressure that had been building for 19 days finally had somewhere to go. He was faster than she expected. That was the truth of it, and later, lying in the dust with her ribs screaming and blood in her mouth, she would think, I underestimated him too. Everyone does, right up until it costs them. The moment she broke his grip, Grant and Appo's forward step became a shot, not a wild swing but a trained one, a shoulder driven low into her sternum, textbook and fast, and the ground came up to meet her before she and Appo's finished registering the movement. Her head cracked against packed dirt. White light bloomed behind her eyes. He was on top of her in the same breath, weight distributed with real skill, one forearm crushing sideways across her collarbone while his other hand, somewhere above her, distant through the ringing in her ears, she heard Ruth shout her name, heard Korea and Appo's boots pounding closer, heard Grant and Appo's voice, low and almost gentle now, terrifyingly close to her ear. And quote, "There it is. There and Appo's the fear. I knew it was in there somewhere." End quote. Her ribs had taken the worst of the fall. Not broken, she and Appo's no broken, but bruised deep enough that every breath came thin and sharp. Blood ran warm from a split at her hairline into the dust beside her cheek. For one long second, flat on her back with a bigger, younger, trained man and Appo's weight bearing down, 20 years fell away, and she was 24 again in a stairwell that smelled like cordite and copper, learning the exact taste of her own fear. Somewhere past the ringing in her ears, a small stubborn part of her mind kept doing arithmetic anyway. $15,000, a surgery date in November, a niece who didn't and Appo's know any of this was happening and never needed to. She was not going to lose this fight to a man who thought her fear was a door he and Appo's finally found the key to. That thought settled under her ribs alongside the pain and gave it somewhere useful to go. She had survived that stairwell. She had survived a great many things since, and none of them had asked her permission first. She breathed. Not the frantic gasping breath of a woman drowning, the other kind. The kind they and Appo's drilled into her for 18 months before her first deployment, the kind that lived somewhere below panic, in a place panic couldn't and Appo's reach. She let her body go loose under him, not in surrender but in reset, and in the half-second his weight shifted forward to press the advantage, she found the gap. Her hips rolled. Her knee came up and in, not a strike, just leverage, just angle, and the arm pinning her collarbone lost its foundation. She caught his wrist, the same wrist that had caught hers, and used his own forward momentum to pull him past her instead of into her. They rolled together in the dirt, and this time when they stopped she had the position. End quote, "Stay down," end quote, she said. Her voice came out rougher than she meant it to. Thick with blood from a split lip, but steady. Grant didn't and Appo's stay down. He was younger, stronger, and furious now in a way that had nothing to do with strategy. Furious the way men get when the story they and Appo's told themselves their whole lives suddenly stops matching what an Appo's happening to their body. He bucked, twisted, tried to drive an elbow back toward her face. She and Appo's spent 4 years relearning how to be gentle after spending 6 learning how not to be. Both lived in her hands now, and she chose in that instant exactly how much of each this moment required. Her arm slid under his, found the angle across the shoulder joint she and Appo's studied not for sport but for necessity, in rooms with no mats and no rules and no 5-minute time limit. She applied pressure the way she and Appo's been taught to apply pressure to a man who would kill her the second the pressure released, not to injure if injury could be avoided, but with the clear, communicated promise that it would come next. End quote. "Tapper Dawn and Appo's end quote, she said, blood dripping steadily off her chin now onto his shoulder. End quote, "I and Appo's we got all day. You Dawn and Appo's End quote. For 3 full seconds, Grant strained against the hold with everything his body had left, and Mara felt her own arms shaking with the effort of holding a stronger man still without breaking him. A harder discipline in its way than the alternative. Then from the direction of the ranch road, tires on gravel fast, and a voice through a truck window that cracked the tension like a rifle shot. End quote. "Sheriff and Appo's department. Everybody stay exactly where you are." End quote. Korea had called it in 9 minutes earlier, the moment Grant and Appo's hand closed on Mara and Appo's wrist. Grant tapped her forearm twice, hard, the universal signal, and Mara released the hold instantly, rolling clear, sitting back in the dirt with blood on her mouth and one hand pressed flat against her ribs, breathing in shallow, careful pulls. She hadn't and Appo's broken anything of his. She and Appo's taken real damage doing it that way. She didn't and Appo's regret the choice. For a moment nobody moved. Ruth stood frozen at the fence rail with one hand pressed over her mouth. Korea was already jogging toward the patrol truck, waving it in, his young face pale under his sunburn. Dale, arm still useless in its sling, stood watching with an expression Mara couldn't and Appo's quite name, something between vindication and grief, as if watching one violence answer another had settled nothing in him after all, only rearranged the weight of it. Deputy Reyes was out of her vehicle before it had fully stopped, hand on her sidearm but not drawing it, taking in the scene with the fast, practiced eye of someone who and oppose. Dee worked plenty of calls that started messier than they finished. Grant was sitting up now, cradling nothing broken, just winded and stunned and, for the first time since Mara had met him, entirely silent. Deputy Ana Reyes had grown up 3 ranches over from Wren Creek, had known Walt Ellison her whole life, and took one look at the scene. The idling cattle trailers, the 80 head of breeding stock half-loaded, Grant Delacroix sitting in handcuffed silence in the dust, Mara Voss bleeding and upright and giving a clear, unhurried account while 6 witnesses corroborated every word, and understood immediately this was an Oppos, Tia bar fight that had wandered onto county land. End quote. Ma and Oppos, you need the hospital, end quote, Reyes said, crouching by Mara. End quote. After the statement, end quote, Mara and Oppos' voice was flat with exhaustion now, the adrenaline draining out and leaving the true cost behind. The deep ache in her ribs, the throb behind her split lip, the tremor she couldn't and Oppos' quite stop in her hands. End quote. Bloodline and Oppos' still standing in that trailer. Somebody needs to authorize it stays put. End quote. It was Ruth who finally got her to sit still, who pressed a clean shop rag to the cut at her hairline, who said, quiet and rough, end quote, you did enough today, Mara. Let somebody else carry it a minute. End quote. Reyes crouched beside her for the statement, notebook balanced on her knee, and asked the questions in the flat, careful order Mara recognized from her own training. Not to trap her, just to build a record nobody could later pick apart. Correa gave his account next, hands still shaking slightly around the words. Then Ruth, then Dale, one arm in its sling and the other pointing at the half-loaded trailers like they were evidence enough on their own. Which, in a way, they were. By the time all 4 statements were down on paper, the sun had moved a full hand and Oppos' width across the sky, and Grant still hadn't and Oppos' said a single word from the back of the patrol car, staring instead at some fixed point past the fence line like a man recalculating a story he and Oppos' been telling himself for 26 years. Walt arrived 40 minutes later, still in his bank meeting clothes, and the sound he made seeing his son in the back of a patrol car was not anger. It was grief, plain and total, a father finally forced to see the whole shape of what he and Oppos' been protecting. The days that followed unspooled slower than the fight itself, but they mattered more. The Amarillo bank meeting, it turned out, had been about the $90,000 note, and the loan officer, once Reyes and Oppos' report reached the county attorney and word got around, quietly disclosed that Grant and Oppos' power of attorney document had been notarized by a friend of his in Houston who and Oppos' since lost his license for exactly this kind of thing. The water rights transfer was frozen within the week. The cattle sale was voided. The buyer, once he understood the stock had been moved without full ownership authority, backed out without a fight of his own, relieved to avoid the mess. Dale and Oppos' settlement, once the county attorney and Oppos' office got involved, stopped being something Walt and Oppos' lawyer whispered about making disappear and became simply what it was, restitution paid in full, with an apology from Walt himself that Dale later told Mara meant more to him than the check. The sheriff and Oppos' department reviewing the full picture, the assault, the unauthorized asset transfer, a pattern that turned out to reach back to the vague trouble in Houston, which was, it emerged, a nearly identical scheme run against a different family business, filed charges that went well beyond a single bad afternoon in a cattle yard. Deputy Reyes, working the case herself, ran down the 2 auction men from the Blue Spur and found the trail Correa had unknowingly handed her weeks earlier. A buyer already lined up, a bill of sale drafted before Grant had legal standing to sign one, cash arranged through a third party specifically so the transaction would leave no bank record for Walt to find. It wasn't an Oppos' just a fight in a cattle yard anymore. It was theft, planned and documented, and the county attorney told Walt privately that without Correa and Oppos' small quiet detail passed along after the fact, they might never have proven intent at all. County Commissioner Ed Whitfield, whose own signature had rubber-stamped part of the water rights paperwork without proper review, stood up at the next open session and admitted, red-faced, in front of a packed room that hadn't and Oppos' seen this much attendance since the school bond vote, that his office had moved too fast on Grant and Oppos' filings and would be tightening review procedures going forward. End quote. We take applicants at their word more often than we should, end quote. he said, and the room was quiet enough that Mara, sitting in the back row in a clean shirt with her ribs still faintly sore under it, could hear the tremor in his voice. End quote. That and Oppos s on us. Not on the folks who trusted us to catch what we didn't and Oppos. T end quote. Sam Okafor 2 rows up said end quote. Damn right end quote. Loud enough to draw a ripple of tired, agreeing laughter, and even Whitfield allowed himself a small, chastened smile at that. It wasn't and Oppos T much. It was more accountability than Mara had expected to see from an elected official in her lifetime, and she noted it quietly from the back row, as a debt the town had finally paid back to itself. The secondary threat resolved itself more slowly, but resolve it did. The water rights transfer, once frozen, was formally reversed at a county hearing in early October, and the irrigation allocation that had quietly been draining toward Grant and Oppos' shell company for 6 months was restored in full to the Ellison Ranch and, just as importantly, to the 2 smaller outfits downstream that had been losing pressure all summer without understanding why. Sam Okafor and Oppos' well had been running low since July. He and Oppos' blamed drought. When the allocation reversed and his pressure came back within a week, he drove the 40 miles out to Wren Creek not to thank Mara for the fight at first, but simply to ask what had happened, and left an hour later, understanding the full shape of it and thanking her anyway. Neighbors she and Oppos' waved to for years but never truly known began showing up at the ranch with casseroles and unasked for help. The Hendersons' 2 sections over sent their boys for 3 days straight to finish fence work Grant had left half done and profitable elsewhere. Old Sam came back a second time unprompted with a truckload of cedar posts he said he end quote, had extra of end quote, though everyone understood he didn't and Oppos' Even the bartender from the Blue Spur drove out one Sunday, awkward in his church clothes, just to tell Mara he wished he and Oppos' said something sooner about the conversation he and Oppos' overheard. The town, which had spent 19 days watching a rich man and Oppos' son bully a quiet foreman and doing nothing, seemed to collectively exhale once the truth came fully into the light, and its guilt turned outward into something useful. At the feed store, at the diner counter, at the auction barn where Grant had once tried to arrange his quiet sale, people who and Oppos' never had 2 words for Mara before now nodded to her by name, held doors, asked after her niece without being asked to. It wasn't an Oppos' fame. It wasn't an Oppos' even gratitude exactly. It was something plainer and better, the town simply remembering all at once that it had a stake in doing right by its own, and deciding belatedly to act like it. Her bonus arrived on September 1st, exactly as contracted, $15,000, wired the same week Walt signed the paperwork restructuring his son and Oppos' ownership stake down to nothing at all. Walt handed her the confirmation slip personally, hat in his hands, unable quite to meet her eyes. End quote. I should and Oppos' listened after the parking lot end quote, he said. End quote. I should and Oppos' listened before that probably. You never once asked me to believe you over my own blood. You just kept doing your job right in front of me until I couldn't and Oppos' not see it. End quote. End quote. You saw it in time end quote, Mara said. End quote. That and Oppos' what matters end quote. It wasn't and Oppos' entirely true. Dale and Oppos' shoulder would ache in cold weather for the rest of his life, and Mara and Oppos' own ribs took 6 slow weeks to stop protesting a hard cough, but it was true enough to build forward on, and forward was the only direction that mattered now. October came in soft and gold across the Wren Creek pastures, the kind of light that made even scar tissue look forgiving. Mara worked the fence line alone most mornings now, the way she preferred, sleeves rolled up without a second thought because there was no one left on the property whose eyes she needed to manage. The scar on her forearm had faded over the years to something closer to a seam than a wound, a place the skin remembered but no longer guarded, and these last 2 months had done more to loosen that old guardedness than the 4 years before them combined. Korea had picked up welding on his own time and fixed the chute gate Grant and Oppos' trailers had bent unasked, the way a young man does when he and Oppos' decided quietly who he wants to become. He and Oppos' started asking Mara questions now too, not about the fight. He seemed to understand instinctively that wasn't an Oppos' his to ask about, but about the service, about what training actually meant versus what a highlight reel made it look like. She answered what she could and left the rest where it belonged, and he seemed to respect the boundary without needing it explained. Ruth still coiled rope at the fence rail most afternoons, unbothered by anything the world had thrown at her in 61 years, and would likely remain unbothered by whatever it threw next. She and Oppos, Dee taken to bringing an extra thermos of coffee most mornings, setting it on the tailgate without comment, and Mara had stopped pretending she didn't and Oppos, T notice or need it. Dale was back on light duty, favoring the shoulder, teaching Korea the parts of the job that required patience more than strength, how to read a cow and Oppos' ears before she spooked, how to move slow enough that the whole herd stayed slow with you. He still winced when the weather turned, but he and Oppos, Dee started laughing again sometime in September, and the sound of it carried well across the yard. Walt had aged in the 2 months since, visibly, the way men do when a long-held illusion finally breaks, but there was less strain in his face now than there and Oppos' Dee been in the 6 months before, the particular exhaustion of pretending gone from his shoulders. He and Oppos' Dee started stopping by the barn most evenings just to talk, not about the ranch, just to talk, the way a man does when he and Oppos' trying to rebuild a habit of honesty, one small conversation at a time. He never mentioned Grant directly. He didn't and Oppos' need to. The absence sat in every conversation anyway, quiet and understood, and Mara let him carry it at whatever pace he could manage. Her niece and Oppos' surgery was scheduled for the 2nd week of November. Paid in full, no complications expected. Mara had put the confirmation letter in the same drawer where she kept a folded photograph nobody at Wren Creek had ever asked to see, and some evenings she took both out together, not out of grief anymore so much as accounting, a private ledger of what had been spent and what had finally been earned back. She still flinched at slamming doors sometimes. She still parked her truck facing out, still pressed her palm flat against her thigh in moments that turned suddenly wrong, and she and Oppos' Dee stopped, somewhere in the last 2 months, trying to talk herself out of either habit. They weren't in Oppos' wounds anymore. They were simply hers, old training that had once kept her alive and now, mostly, just kept her honest about where she and Oppos' Dee been. In the evenings when the herd settled and the light went long and copper across the north pasture, she and Oppos' Dee walked the fence one more slow lap before supper, checking nothing in particular, just moving through the quiet the way she liked to, boots soft in the dust, hands loose at her sides, nothing left in the air around her that needed watching. Sometimes Ruth walked with her, not talking, just matching pace, the two of them content to let the silence do what conversation didn't and Oppos' need to. Sometimes it was Korea, full of questions about welding or weather, or once, hesitantly, about whether the fear ever really left a person or just learned to sit quieter. Mara had thought about that one a long while before answering. End quote, it sits quieter, end quote, she and Oppos' Dee told him finally. End quote, it doesn't and Oppos' leave. You just get better at deciding what it and Oppos' allowed to run. End quote, he and Oppos' Dee nodded like that meant something to him, and maybe it had. Most evenings though she walked it alone, and that was fine too. There was a particular kind of peace in a fence line checked out of habit rather than fear. In boots that moved slow because slow was simply how the work went, not because something behind her needed watching. She and Oppos' Dee spent a long time not knowing the difference. She knew it now, clean and simple, the way she knew the weight of a gate or the sound of rain coming before it arrived. The ranch was hers to run again, uncontested. The bloodline stood safe in the north pasture, 90 headstrong come spring. And somewhere behind her, back at the house, a light came on in the kitchen window, Walt probably starting supper early the way he and Oppos' Dee taken to doing, humming something low and off-key to a radio only he could hear. Mara stood a moment at the fence line, watching the last of the color drain gold to gray above the tree line, and let herself finally feel nothing more complicated than tired and warm and home.